Hello, this is Dan Lewis. I will be your lecturer for this series on the post-exilic prophets. There are three prophets that come at the end of the scroll, which in the Hebrew Bible is called the 12, or what typically we call the minor prophets. And these last three, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, are voices to the people of Israel after they have come back from exile. I've called this series The Burden of Disillusionment because one of the big problems with the community that came back from Babylon to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and to rebuild the city is that particularly in the early years of this trek back to Jerusalem, there was a lot of discouragement, a lot of disappointment, a lot of disillusionment. And it is in fact that disillusionment that caused them to suspend the work on the temple. And primarily it is these two voices, the first two of the post-exilic prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, who are able to inspire the people to once again pick up the work and to finish what had been begun. To frame this series, I think it's important for us to talk about the hope beyond exile. Exile, which the prophets preached about, was never God's last word. But rather, God said that on the other side of exile, there would be hope for a remnant of people who would survive. And that idea begins very, very early. It begins in the northern nation with the two prophets Amos and Hosea, who about a century and a half or so prior to the time that we're looking at, still talked about the exile of the people of Israel, but also the idea that God would plant them in their own land. He would bring them back. They would return to the lands which they had lost, and that they would be established there. And then in the southern nation, you find the same kind of idea in the two voices of Micah and Isaiah, which are roughly contemporaneous with Amos and Hosea. And in these passages, you run into the word remnant a number of times. The word remnant means the piece that is left over, or those who would survive the exile. And to that remnant, there was promised a hope that not only would they survive, but that they would come back into a glorious return to Jerusalem, they would be assembled, and that God would bless them. This idea of the coming back of the people and the blessing of renewal was also carried on in the 7th and the 6th centuries by prophets like Jeremiah and Zephaniah, who were contemporaries, and as well as Ezekiel, who was a prophet that preached in the land of Babylon. And again, there is this basic language, I will gather those who have been scattered, or I will gather the remnant of my flock. I will gather you from among the nations. And so this was part of the hope on the other side of exile that inspired the people to return from Babylon to Jerusalem, a return that is described in considerable detail in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. The two prophets that we're going to initially look at, Haggai and Zechariah, should be directly connected to the events in the early part of the book of Ezra. One of the interesting features that you find in all of the prophets is this link with the family of David with respect to the hope for the future. God said that he would do something after the exile and bringing the people back, but this future is somehow connected with the family of David. So you find that, first of all, again, in the earliest of the writing prophets, Amos and Hosea. God says, in that day I will restore David's fallen tent. And in Hosea afterward, the Israelites will seek David their king. This is all the more remarkable in that these statements were made to the northern nations who had rejected the family of David and who had rejected the temple in Jerusalem. But nonetheless, these voices to the north still linked the future with the family of David. And you find that idea repeated in the books of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, all of whom mention David and the family of David as part of this hope for the future. Furthermore, there would be a remarkable spiritual character to this renewal. When the Israelites would come back, they would come back with changed hearts. They would come back, as it says in Isaiah, on a highway of holiness. The unclean would not journey on it, only the redeemed would walk there. And Zephaniah says, I will leave within you the meek and the humble who trust in the name of the Lord. It's hard to believe that this statement in Zephaniah, that I leave within you the meek and the humble, may not sort of lie behind the statement of Jesus in the New Testament that the meek would inherit the earth. And particularly Jeremiah says that God would give them a heart to know Him. They will be my people, he says, and I will be their God, and they will return to me with all of their heart. I will cleanse them from all the sins they have committed, and I will forgive their sins. And Ezekiel says, I will sprinkle clean water upon them, and they will be clean. So as we begin reading in the book of Isaiah, particularly in the latter part of Isaiah, there is this good news to Mount Zion. Zion will be redeemed with justice. Those who are going to be the voices of God to the people, they will bring the gospel to Zion, this mountain that once held Solomon's first temple, and now is going to be the site of the rebuilding of the second temple. And so Isaiah says, lift your voice with a shout. Say to the towns of Judah, here is your God. The redeemed of the Lord will return, and they will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. And then, of course, in the latter part of Ezekiel, there is the promise that the glory of the Lord, the glory that abandoned the temple and removed itself from the temple before its destruction by Nebuchadnezzar, would now come back and would fill a second temple. So there is this repeating phrase that you find in Jeremiah, you find it in Isaiah, you find it in Ezekiel, you find it in Zechariah, one of the post-exilic prophets. This covenant statement, they will be my people and I will be their God. This is the hope for the future on the other side of exile. Now, as you may remember, if you have read the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, there was a decree that was established by Cyrus, the Persian emperor, that those who had been displaced in his empire could return back to the lands that they formerly inhabited. And this is not only recorded in the Bible at the end of 2 Chronicles in the beginning of the book of Ezra, it's also recorded on a clay barrel, which is one of the most famous artifacts in the world. It resides in the British Museum in London, England. And this barrel, called the Cyrus cylinder, is a Persian version of the decree of Cyrus to allow people to go back and to rebuild their ancient temples and their ancient cities. The leaders of the group that came back to do that came first of all with a leader by the name of Sheshbazzar, but he disappears rather early in the book of Ezra. And the two figures that are then most prominent after that will be the figure of Zerubbabel, who is the governor that comes with the authority of the Persian Empire to rebuild the temple, and who was also a descendant of King Jehoiakim, who had been exiled many years earlier. And then also a second figure by the name of Joshua, who was a high priest from the line of Aaron. And so these two figures, Zerubbabel and Joshua, are important in the book of Ezra, but you're going to find they will also be important, particularly in the books of Haggai and Zechariah. When the Jews returned from Babylon to Jerusalem, there is a great mood of expectancy as they come back to their ancient city. And this is captured very vividly and poignantly in the 126th Psalm. It says, when Yahweh brought back the captives to Zion, we were like men who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter and our tongues with songs of joy. And then it was said among the nations, Yahweh has done great things for them. Yahweh has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy. There was so much expectancy coming back from Babylon to Jerusalem, and they had probably, many of them had never, of course, been in Jerusalem. They had been born in Babylon during the exile, but they had heard the stories from their parents and their grandparents about the glories of the temple that Solomon had built, and now they were coming back to rebuild. They began with the construction of the great altar, as you find described early in the book of Ezra. We don't know exactly what this altar looked like. Here are a couple of examples, one from Beersheba in the 8th century, and the other around the northern nation of Tel Dan in about the 9th century. Both of them are Israelite altars which feature 4 horns, or these 4 corner projections that are on the altar, probably used to snub down the sacrificial victims which were laid on the altar. So we don't know if the great altar they built was like this exactly, but presumably it looked something like this. And then with the great altar now rebuilt, they were able to reinstate temple ritual, as you find in the book of Ezra, and also in the book of 1st Esdras in the Apocrypha, chapter 5. The daily offering, the tamid, was now able to be offered in each morning and each evening, so twice a day. The daily offering was offered in according to the law of Moses, and they were able to reinstate the liturgical calendar of the annual festivals. That would include Passover and the festival of unleavened bread, along with the festival of first fruits. It would include the middle of the Haggim, or the pilgrim festivals, called the Festival of Weeks. And it would include then the great festival at the end of the year, the Festival of Sukkot, or Booths. And along with that, there was also the one-day celebration of Yom Kippur, which is the Day of National Atonement, as well as a Festival of Trumpets, which later will coincide with the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah. They could also offer the sacrifices connected with the new moon. So the building of the great altar was an incredible beginning and a reinstatement of those things that they had lost. And now they were to rebuild the temple itself. But here is where we find that they meet great opposition, because the project is going to come to a halt. There had been opposition all along from the surrounding populace, and now that comes to a head. At first, the locals offered to actually help build the temple, but they're turned down very abruptly in the book of Ezra. And so because they were not allowed to help rebuild the temple, they set out to discourage the project. And you find this detailed in the first part of Ezra chapter 4. In fact, when they begin to lay the foundations of the new temple, some of the people were quite disappointed in the work so far, and eventually they became so discouraged that the work stopped altogether. So if you look at the chronology from the change of Babylon to Persia all the way down to the temple project, it works like this. In 539 BC, Cyrus conquered the city of Babylon. And late in 539 or early in 538, he gave this edict of repatriation, in which he would allow all the displaced peoples in his empire to go back to their ancestral homes and rebuild their temples. And of course, it's because of that decree that the Jews are able to return to Jerusalem in 538. In 537, they have now completed the construction of the great altar. And in 536, the next year, they begin laying the foundation for the new temple. But it's right here, after the foundation of the new temple is laid, that they become very discouraged because of the opposition surrounding him, and the work is suspended. And according to Ezra 4 and verse 24, that work would be suspended throughout the reigns of Cyrus, Cambyses, and into the second year of the reign of Darius the Great. Now it's right here in the second year of Darius the Great that we have the ministry of Haggai and Zechariah, two of the three post-exilic prophets, because it is the preaching and the sermons of these two prophets that is going to inspire the people to pick up the work again after a 16-year hiatus. And so in 520 BC, at the preaching of Haggai and Zechariah, the work is going to be resumed, and in fact will be carried on to completion. So for 16 years, there has been this long period where nothing has happened. The mission of building this second temple has come to a halt. The people are very disappointed. They have experienced quite a number of problems in addition just to the persecution that they receive from the locals. And if you read the first chapter of the book of Haggai, you'll notice that they went through a series of droughts, a series of crop failures, what Zechariah calls the day of small things. As Haggai describes it this way, he says, "Consider, you have sown much, but you've harvested little. The crops are not doing well. You eat, but you never have enough. People are going hungry. You drink, but you never have your fill. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm. He who earns wages does so to put them into a bag with holes." All of these descriptions that you find early in the book of Haggai are descriptions of difficulties that the people experienced during this period of time. And this is what later Zechariah is going to call a day of small things. There was continuous antagonism, of course, from locals as well. And so the combination of all of these kinds of things, antagonism from local peoples, crop failure, a drought, general attitudes of disillusionment. All of these things pressed down upon the people so that they just absolutely felt they could not go on with the work in the temple. And it's in that context, after this 16-year hiatus, that these two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, come to the forefront. These two prophets are mentioned twice in the book of Ezra, once in chapter 5 and once in chapter 6. And so what it says in the book of Ezra is, now the prophets Haggai and Zechariah ben Iddo prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. And then later in chapter 6 it says, so the elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai and Zechariah ben Iddo. So these two prophets are really critical for the picking up of this work and carrying it forward, as it is described here. To give you kind of a summary of these two prophets before we begin to look at them in detail, Haggai begins by chiding the people that they are now preoccupied with their own homes. They're paneling their own houses, but they're letting the temple go. And so he encourages them and he says to them, God has promised to come back to this temple in glory if you will build it. And in fact, the glory of this second temple will be even greater than the glory of the first one. If you remember all the way back in the time of Solomon, when Solomon built the very first temple, at the dedication of the temple, the cloud of the glory of God filled that first temple. And now Haggai says the glory of the second temple is going to be even greater than the glory that Solomon experienced. And so he assured them that God had a purpose for the future. And part of that purpose for the future concerned this temple that they were to build. So they must get back to work. They must resume the work on the temple. Zechariah, the contemporary of Haggai, also preaches to the same end. In fact, he announces that God was eager for this reconstruction and he was angry at those who opposed it. He promised that those who would continue to build the temple, that he would bless them, he would give them prosperity, and he urged that the project would be successful. In fact, he said that Zerubbabel, the leader of the project, would be empowered by the Spirit of God. He predicted that he had laid the foundation and he would also be the one to complete it. So within the lifespan of this one man, Zerubbabel, both the foundation had been laid and the actual temple would be completed. So in short then, the future was a bright future if they would simply pick up their hands and continue with the work of rebuilding the temple. Well, these sermons had their effect and people listened and they decided these prophets are right, they are correct. We need to go back to rebuilding the temple. So with the support of Haggai and Zechariah, Zerubbabel the governor and Joshua the high priest and all of the people began to resume the work. And they did this in the second year of Darius the Great. Well, they still had to contend with opposition, as you find in the book of Ezra. And one of those was they had to now reaffirm the original decree that they could do this. And a search was made all the way back in Ecbatana in Persia to find the original document that authorized them to do this. This would be more or less comparable to what I suppose in a modern context we would call a building permit. But in fact, this was actually discovered. And it lists Sheshbazzar as the leader of the group. The original decree was discovered, as I mentioned, in Ecbatana. And so now Darius is going to order the governor of the Trans-Euphrates province to actually pay expenses for this construction, as well as to provide sacrificial animals for the great altar. So the work is resumed. People are now moved from dead center. They're back into the flow of things. They're back with their hands working hard to rebuild the temple in the second year of Darius the Great. This is a bas-relief of Darius the Great, who reaffirms the authorization of the Jews to rebuild the temple. And it is, in fact, the second year of his reign that is the same year as the preaching of Haggai and Zechariah. So with those things in mind, we are ready to begin the book of Haggai.